In the capital city of Ottawa, the fate of one man was about to change forever. A more than 40-year-long battle for innocence all began on one summer's afternoon back in 1967. Romeo Phillion's life would soon be completely turned upside down, and he would be left searching for justice the rest of his life. It was a Wednesday, August 9th to be exact, when a 20-year-old Ottawa veteran firefighter named Leopold Roy was found stabbed to death in an Ottawa apartment building where he was the superintendent. Mildred, his wife, was engaged in housework in the apartment complex when she observed a suspicious man lurking in the corridor. She called out to her husband, who was in the basement, but when he did not reply, she called out a second time, and at this point she could hear him coming up the stairs. The man, who appeared nervous, ran through the hallway to the back stairs, jumped over the railing, and here Mr. Roy was able to catch him. Mr. Roy instructed his wife to go down to their apartment. She then heard her husband call out, "Don't call the police, call a doctor." The only other person who had seen Mr. Roy was Mr. Herbert, the oil burner serviceman who had been talking to him prior to the incident. Mr. Herbert was the one who found Mr. Roy with a knife wound below his heart. He went outside to his truck and radioed his company to send the police, but unfortunately, it was too late by the time the police arrived. Mildred provided a description of the man to Ottawa Police Department. The next day, Detective John McCoby showed Miss Roy a photo lineup of 10 different men, including Romeo and his identical twin brother, Donald. Originally, Miss Roy picked Donald. However, the police are notified that the Phillion brothers were in New Lizard, and Detective McCoby, along with his partner Detective Colborne, traveled there to verify that Donald had been at work on August 9th. So, lucky for Donald, this meant he could not have committed the murder and was released. However, the following days and years would prove to be a different story for Romeo. 4 days later, on August 13th, Romeo is arrested on an unrelated charge and finds himself back in the police station. Then on August 15th, Mildred views a photo lineup that contains Romeo, and she identifies him as the perpetrator. When Mildred is brought into the lineup room, she states that Romeo does resemble the man she saw prior to her husband's murder, but is not certain if he is in fact the murderer. She is not able to make a positive identification, so he is released. 4.5 years pass by and the case makes no significant progress. There was no substantial evidence left at the crime scene, and the murder weapon was never found. The only minor advance was a few possible leads, but these were later found to be insignificant. Mildred identified 3 other men as possible suspects, but the police released them all without laying any new charges. Now January 11th, 1972, and once again Romeo is caught breaking the law. This time he is arrested for an armed robbery of a taxi driver in Ottawa. He is taken into police custody, and on the way to the cell area, the detective in charge asks Romeo if he would like to tell him anything else. In response, Romeo asks what Neil Miller, his lover, had told them. The detective plays along and responds by saying that Neil had told the police a lot about the things you bragged about to him. Suddenly, Romeo confessed to murdering the fireman, shocking the detective. Romeo described that he had murdered Mr. Roy several years ago and that he would make an official confession after he saw Neil. The police allowed this meeting, so Romeo signed his written confession. Neil also told the police that 4 days prior to Romeo's arrest, Romeo made a similar confession to him. In the end, Romeo was charged with the non-capital murder of Leopold Roy, and he retained defense counsel Mr. J. Arthur Cogan. Flash forward to October 16, 1972, and Romeo's 3-week trial began. The Crown prosecutor built their case on 3 central pieces of evidence: the eyewitness and photo lineup identification of Romeo by Mildred, Romeo's voluntary confession to the police, and finally Romeo's confession to Neil. Despite his voluntary confession at the time, Romeo later recanted his confession to another police officer that same night. He explained that he was innocent and that his confession was part of a larger scheme with Neil to send the police on a wild goose chase. The reason for confessing was so that they could collect the reward money from Neil's report of his confession. The defense team argued that their client was innocent. Two experts stated that Romeo suffered from antisocial personality disorder, and this caused him to lie and invent stories to make him feel important. Furthermore, his lawyer argued that police had lost pieces of evidence and this obstructed the case. However, on November 7, 1972, the trial ended, and a guilty verdict was reached. His sentence, life in prison with no parole eligibility for 10 years. In 1998, 26 years after being convicted of murder, Romeo received an envelope which contained police reports from his Corrections Canada file. One document was a police investigation report that had been prepared on April 12, 1968 by Detective McCoby, and it provided an alibi for Romeo's whereabouts on the day of the murder. This new significant evidence would allow Romeo's case to be reopened. This turn of events would allow Romeo's miscarriage of justice to finally be analyzed. The full extent of wrongful convictions is not entirely known, but there are estimates that about 20% of all convictions in the United States may be wrongful. Wrongful convictions are a product of a multitude of systemic factors. However, the reality is that the problem lies not with the individual, but rather within the structure of the criminal justice system itself. In Romeo's case, a number of factors led to his wrongful conviction. Poor eyewitness testimony is one of the most commonly cited factors that leads to wrongful convictions. In fact, 52% of wrongful convictions involve eyewitness misidentification. For Romeo, the trial put too much emphasis on Miss Roy's faulty eyewitness testimony. First of all, estimator variables, those variables that are present at the time of the crime and are not able to be manipulated, are known to influence the accuracy of an eyewitness identification. It would be fair to suggest that Miss Roy would have most likely experienced heightened arousal in the moments before her husband was murdered, as she was on high alert about the suspicious man wandering around. She even felt uneasy to the point that she calls out her husband numerous times to get his attention. Furthermore, her exposure time to the assailant was brief, as she only saw his face 3 times, hampering her ability to correctly remember all the details of his appearance. Also, when Miss Roy is first brought into the police station and presented with a photo lineup, she falsely identifies Romeo Phillion as the attacker. Then, during the second photo lineup, she is not able to make a positive identification of Romeo. And finally, she also falsely identifies 3 other men during the course of the investigation. Given the various influences at work and the tendency to view eyewitness testimony as highly reliable, the Crown should have cautioned the jury against relying on Miss Roy's testimony as evidence of Romeo's guilt. Another issue in Romeo's wrongful conviction has to do with his false confession. Romeo suffered from both antisocial personality disorder and borderline personality disorder, which very likely played a role in his false confession. Dr. Good Johnson, an expert in the psychology of false confessions, gave a testimony on why someone like Romeo would confess to such a serious crime when he did not actually do so. He explained that Romeo could have possibly been motivated by 5 factors in particular, such as a desire for notoriety, revenge, and a desire to aid and protect someone else. Psychiatrist Dr. Arboleda, who testified that he had questioned Romeo about the truth of his confessions after giving him a so-called truth serum, concluded in his testimony that juries and the public are made to believe that a false confession is highly improbable and that an innocent person would never confess to a crime they did not commit, although the reality is not all that simple. And thinking on the basis of these 2 expert testimonies, one can recognize that there are different tactics, conditions, and pressures that influence the likelihood of an innocent person to falsely confess. Romeo's wrongful conviction was also the result of police malpractice in a disorganized investigation. There is proof that the police lost pieces of evidence, failed to keep adequate records of their investigation, and failed to disclose all of the reports. This suppression of evidence was detrimental to proving Romeo's innocence. Arthur Cogan, Romeo's lawyer at the time, noticed that a hair sample, fingernail scrapings, blood, and hair samples taken from Leopold had all gone missing. Also, the photographs used in the lineup that was shown to Miss Roy had all been lost. This prevented the jury from having the opportunity to examine and assess the impact the photos may have had on Miss Roy's initial identification. In addition, there was the fact that Detective McCoby did not disclose Mr. Phillion's alibi when he completed the report back in April 1968. Since the alibi was not disclosed until many years later, it was impossible to be used in trial or to be used as evidence that Romeo was not present at the crime scene. The alibi indicated the following. Another passage in the April 1968 report reads, "It would appear, though, that in the well-maintained files of the new Liskeard Police Department no such letter had been found, and it was concluded that the police department had not received either the 1968 report or its contents." When police engage in misconduct, the risk of detection is so low that there is a strong incentive for them to deviate. The state is reluctant to punish and apply criminal sanctions to those guilty of such professional malpractice. The criminal justice system is seen as an infallible, highly respectable, and reputable bureaucratic structure, so when errors are made, no one will question or challenge their mistakes. The final factor in Romeo's wrongful conviction is his marginalized social status. As a child, Romeo was sent away to St. Joseph's training school by his father, as him and his twin were mischievous and unruly. He was subsequently abused and beaten while there. Later, he was sent on his way to survive in a world where he had no real home or a support network, so he found himself having to live off the avails of prostitution, robbery, and assault. Because of his actions, he gained a criminal record. He was part of a vulnerable sector given his sexual minority status as bisexual and low social class. Though it does not explicitly state that his marginalized identity was a causal factor in his wrongful conviction, it could have very well played a role. Those who are underprivileged are the most frequent targets of wrongful convictions. The police tend to develop an us versus them mentality, and they ultimately believe that their wrongdoings will be justified. The legal system is an extension of the dominant class, which serves to protect and perpetuate their values and attitudes out into society while disproportionately punishing the lower classes. When Romeo became eligible for parole in 1982, he gave up applying because it required an admission of guilt, and he was not prepared to admit to a crime that he did not commit. Therefore, Romeo was the longest-serving innocent Canadian to have a murder conviction quashed in spite of being wrongfully convicted. The Innocence Project and Innocence Canada submitted a Section 6961 application for ministerial review in May of 2013. A couple months later, in July, he was released on $50,000 bail. But it was not until April 29, 2010 that the murder charge was finally withdrawn. April 29th happened to be his 71st birthday, and in a news report he was quoted saying, "I got an apology from the judge, which was a gift today. I was not expecting that." An apology can go a long way and represents the government and criminal justice system taking responsibility for their wrongdoings. As we know, Canada does not have mandatory compensation. There is a long wait, it requires significant amount of financial resources, and because of the number of appeals to prove one's factual innocence, it is a lengthy process.
My birthday, 81 years old today. It's a beautiful day. The judge has apologized for the wrongful thing happened, and I'm so happy. Waited 38 years for this.
Lawyer James Lockyer lost his bid to have Phillion arraigned and speedily acquitted of the murder charge, but he said that what Ratushny did made up for all that.
You know, I came here with my head down a bit. I was anxious about it, but I'm really pleased what Justice Ratushny did. It was just great for Romeo, and it was great for the administration of justice, and it was great for me too.
Romeo fought tirelessly for compensation, but he was denied the right to sue by Superior Court Justice Eva Frank, but this decision was later overturned on appeal by the Supreme Court of Canada. Sadly, though, Romeo passed away at age 76 on November 2nd in 2015, before he could receive any compensation. He was a strong supporter of other people who were also victims of the systematic issue of wrongful conviction and is greatly missed in the community. As a society, we need more people like Romeo and other activist organizations who are willing to advocate for system-wide legal transformation and social equality.